people, the headlines, the issues impacting you and your family. This Week in Cincinnati on WCPO 9.
Welcome to This Week in Cincinnati. I'm Tanya O'Rourke. Thank you for watching us on air and on your favorite streaming device. Today we are speaking with Senate Majority Leader and Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell. Democrat Amy McGrath is trying to unseat McConnell, who's seeking a 7th term in the Senate. The race is extraordinarily expensive. Open Secrets estimates that as of last June, the candidates had already spent more than $50 million combined. We have invited Amy McGrath to join us for This Week in Cincinnati. I spoke with Senator McConnell last Tuesday via Zoom. Senator, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time. We appreciate it. You have been representing the Commonwealth of Kentucky in the U.S. Senate since 1985, the leader of the GOP in the Senate since 2007. So tell our viewers, many of them in Northern Kentucky, what you've done with your time in Washington that has specifically helped the people of Kentucky.
Well, why don't we start with the opioid epidemic? $275 million for Kentucky, including the $87 million grant for UK, which is the largest grant in their history. And let's look at the CARES Act, written in my office back in March and April of this very year to deal with the coronavirus pandemic afflicting us all. $186 million for Kenton, Campbell, and Boone counties out of the CARES Act. So those are some recent examples of how having me as one of the 4 congressional leaders, and in fact the only one not from New York or California, benefits Kentucky and gives us the opportunity to punch above our weight.
All right, so let's talk about the Supreme Court, and we want to acknowledge that we are taping this on Tuesday and to air on the weekend. Lots can change in that time, but an ABC News Washington Post poll released last Friday shows 57% of Americans polled favored delaying the Supreme Court process until after the election. Only 37% of Americans say you should go for it. So we know that you will, but help the people of Northern Kentucky understand why it is you will go forth.
Well, first, I think the poll does not reflect the nominee. That was taken before we had Amy Coney Barrett out front and the American people an opportunity to see who we're talking about. It's no longer a hypothetical, it's a real person. Under the Constitution, the president has the right to nominate, and the Senate has the right to either advise and consent or withhold advice and consent. We've had 2 episodes in the last 4 years with vacancies in a presidential year, quite unusual. In 2016, the Senate was in the hands of the Republican Party, the White House in the hands of the Democratic Party, and not surprisingly, consistent with American history, the vacancy was not filled. In fact, you'd have to go back to the 1880s to find the last time a Senate of a different party than the president filled a vacancy in a presidential election year. Quite the contrary, when the White House and the Senate are of the same party, nominations occurring in a presidential election year, the president has made 8. 7 times they were acted upon and confirmed. 1 nomination blew up in a scandal. So what we're seeing now is entirely consistent with American history in terms of dealing with advice and consent. And I would say the American people, once they have an opportunity to get to know Judge Barrett, which I just began the process myself of meeting with her on the day that we're recording this, I think they'll warm up to this nomination and find her a very compelling figure.
You just met with her, you said, on this particular day of this recording. So what did she have to say that assured you that she would be a good representative at the Supreme Court justice, but would also reflect the wishes of the folks of Northern Kentucky?
Well, just to give you an example, there was an interesting op-ed in the Washington Post over the weekend by a former professor of hers who said she was the single most outstanding student he had ever had. This was a law professor at Notre Dame, where she went to law school. Said she was the best student he ever had. She then clerked for Lawrence Silberman on the D.C. Circuit, and then clerked for Justice Scalia on the U.S. Supreme Court. She was given a unanimous well qualified by the American Bar Association when she was nominated for the Seventh Circuit, where she sits now. And by any objective standard, a stunningly successful lawyer.
But was there anything that she said to you today that you could share with us?
Well, it was a private conversation. I actually, we talked about tailgating. She liked to tailgate at the Notre Dame games, and I like to tailgate at the University of Louisville games. And I also asked her the obvious questions. I said, you and your husband must be extremely well organized to both have busy careers and balance not one, but 7 children. So the kind of personal conversations you would have in a private setting.
So you are going to bring forth the Supreme Court nominee. The House is expected to pass another stimulus bill potentially this week. Will you bring that to the Senate floor?
Well, I'd sure like to see another deal. We've been trying to get the Speaker to sit down and agree with the administration for 2 months now, and unfortunately, the sparring back and forth has not produced an outcome. I would really like to see an outcome. The only way you get an outcome is for the president, who has to sign the bill, to agree with the Democrats, who have to pass it through the House. If we can get to a point where we can have an agreement and get an outcome, that's my first choice. The CARES Act, which I mentioned earlier, which was written in my office, has done a lot of good. But some of those provisions need to be re-upped. For example, the PPP, the Small Business Loan Program, just to look at it from a Kentucky point of view, over 50,000 Kentucky small businesses accessed $5.2 billion in direct loans that are forgivable if you maintain employment. Well, that fund needs to be replenished. So that's an example of why we need yet another rescue package.
So you're saying right now you would not bring that bill forward?
Well, we'll have to see what it looks like and if they pass it. The best way to get an outcome, however, is to know that you can get a presidential signature.
Let's talk about, in part because of the emergency relief, because of the pandemic, the federal debt has absolutely skyrocketed. It'll be about $27 trillion next year and larger than the U.S. economy, potentially. So a lot of federal spending is absolutely locked in. So there comes a point where you either have to raise taxes or you have to cut significantly. Where you would cut is what I'd like to know, or will you raise taxes?
Well, look, you're absolutely right. After the CARES Act, the size of our debt is the size of our economy. That hadn't happened since World War II. This is very, very concerning. And one of the principal reasons when the Speaker passed a bill to add $3 trillion more to the debt, I said, wait a minute, let's see if we can target the problem rather than just continuing to mount the debt. And that's why so far we haven't been able to reach an agreement. With regard to the long-term debt, it's a very serious problem. It's going to require bipartisan cooperation to begin to shrink the national debt down to an acceptable level.
But bipartisan cooperation has not been a forte of Congress in the last, I don't know, half a generation. So how do you suspect you're going to go about that?
Well, we have to overcome our partisan impulses and try to get bipartisan agreements. By the way, there have been some examples. I did 3 major deals during the Obama years with Joe Biden. He negotiated for President Obama. I negotiated for the Republicans in Congress. And we did 3 major deals in 2010, 2011, and 2012. So bipartisan agreements are not totally uncommon, just not as occurring as often as we would like.
So it comes down to either you're going to have to cut spending, as we talked about, or raise taxes. And spending would, I mean, in all likelihood, has to come out of defense. Are you in favor of that or tax hike?
Well, I'm not in favor of negotiating the deal with you here today. I would be more than happy to negotiate a deal with the Democrats because we have to have both sides on board to do anything as difficult as tackling the national debt.
Well, we do have to tackle some big subjects when we come back. We're going to talk about the I-75 bridge and race relations when This Week in Cincinnati continues. And we're back at This Week in Cincinnati with a conversation with Senator Mitch McConnell. Thanks so much again for being with us. Amy McGrath has a new ad on the air saying that she will get the Brent Spence Bridge fixed. It is an economic lifeline for Kentucky, and it desperately does need to be fixed. Now, we spoke with Congressman Chabot recently. He told me that he's got Ohio on board, that Kentucky needs to get on board. So can you pledge to get this bridge replaced in your next term if you're reelected?
Yeah, I saw the ad my opponent is running. I assume that means she's in favor of tolls because we all know that the solution to building the Brent Spence Bridge is in Frankfurt. It's a state issue. Most of us who are running statewide, including myself, have decided tolls are a bad idea. It's a particularly burdensome thing on Northern Kentucky residents commuting every day. So I assume my opponent, who says she's going to get this done, is endorsing tolls before the state legislature.
Let
me tell you what we're doing in the meantime at the federal level, where there is the possibility of some improvements. I've delivered $77 million for incremental improvements around the interstate during the Trump years, during these 4 years. That's what can be done in Washington. The Brent Spence Bridge can only be rebuilt if the state legislature decides to levy tolls. So my assumption is my opponent has come out for tolls because that is the only way this bridge will get constructed. It's a state decision. In the meantime, as the majority leader of the Senate, I've been delivering what's achievable at the federal level consistently, including the $77 million in the last couple of years.
Let's move on to race relations. There is a lot of tension and anger in the country right now. Obviously, you know what's going on in Louisville with the Breonna Taylor case. You were at the 1963 March on Washington. You were quite passionate about civil rights after that. So can you understand why so many Black Americans are angry and others are angry right now? And what is it that you feel can be done to address that?
I do understand why people are angry. And if you look at what happened to Breonna Taylor, clearly this was an outrageous end to this breaking in to the apartment. The dilemma, I guess, that the Attorney General and others looking at this case have is that in order to operate in the justice system, you have to follow the law and the evidence that applied to the law, and he's been in a very, very difficult situation. But I can certainly understand why there's widespread unhappiness with the charges that were brought. But what is the appropriate way to react? The appropriate way to react is peaceful demonstrations, which are constitutionally protected activity. The inappropriate way to react is looting and rioting and shooting police officers, 2 of whom were shot last week. There's a difference between peaceful protesting and criminal activity. I have total tolerance for peaceful protesting. I have no tolerance for looting, rioting, and shooting police officers.
Senator McConnell, we are having a wonderful conversation with you. We're going to continue that conversation when we come back on This Week in Cincinnati and talking about gun rights and healthcare. We'll be right back. We are back on This Week in Cincinnati with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. About a year ago, it was reported you said you'd be willing to bring gun legislation, gun control legislation, to be specific, to the floor if the president supported it. Has anything come of that?
Yeah, the president never decided which bill he would support. And so as a result of that, we ended up not being able to schedule it on the Senate floor. I've consistently said I want to make a law, not just make a point. If we'd been able to reach an agreement, and we're having a similar experience right now with another rescue package that can actually become a law, I think we ought to move forward.
You are a big supporter of Second Amendment rights. In 2018, though 2 people died in the shooting at the Marshall County High School, that was, of course, in the Commonwealth. At the time, you said there wasn't much that Congress could do about that other than appropriate funds. Do you still feel that way?
Yeah, I mean, law enforcement basically of this sort is done at the local level, and it's a challenge. I think the best solution to that was to help the schools strengthen their infrastructure, help them pay for additional guards to secure the schools. Most of them are freestanding buildings. You ought to be able, with proper funding, to secure those buildings to prevent firearms from being carried into a building. Fundamentally, that's a state responsibility to fund education, but we have passed legislation to provide additional funding. And by the way, speaking of education, I also think if we do another rescue package at the federal level related to the coronavirus, a heavy percentage of it ought to be for the schools, so our kids can get safely back to school if the local superintendents decide to have in-person learning.
I want to turn to healthcare now, and Obamacare specifically. When you were just 2 years old, you were hit with polio. You said it nearly bankrupted your entire family, and so you certainly know the value of healthcare and affordable healthcare at that. The GOP does not seem to have, well, they certainly don't like Obamacare, but not a unified, detailed, or workable plan to replace it. Why is that?
Well, the Democrats passed Obamacare. It includes coverage for pre-existing conditions. Everybody's in favor of coverage for pre-existing conditions. The Democrats in the middle of the presidential campaign are claiming somehow confirming Judge Barrett to the Supreme Court would threaten pre-existing conditions. There's nobody in Washington not opposed to mandating coverage of pre-existing conditions. That is the law today and will be the law continuously, no matter the outcome. But it is funny to see the Democrats complaining about Obamacare being inadequate because they were so committed to passing it.
While we have time, I want to talk about absentee ballots. Voting by mail, mass mailings and applications for absentee ballots. The president has been promoting debunked claims about voter fraud. He's even indicated he's not going to cooperate with a peaceful transfer of power should he not win re-election. So do you think the president is deliberately trying to undermine the democratic process?
Well, let me take them one at a time. There'll be an orderly transfer of power on January the 20th, 2021 to whomever wins the election on November 3rd. No question about that. Number two, mail-in ballots are more challenging, and we're doing more of it this year because of the coronavirus. But I'm confident the post office can handle it. We'll be doing more voting by mail in Kentucky this year than we have in the past because of the coronavirus. So I want to settle this all down, let everybody know the post office is going to be able to handle it. Any challenges that develop will be because of state law, because states conduct the election. Some states say your mail-in ballot has to be postmarked by election day. Some say they'll count them if it received a week later. There will be potentially some confusion in some states, but overall, no reason to doubt that we won't have an honest election properly conducted, but those decisions are made in each and every state.
With that, we're going to have to leave this conversation. Our time with you has come to an end. Senator Mitch McConnell, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
That's all for This Week in Cincinnati. We have invited the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate in Kentucky, Amy McGrath, to join us for the program. Let us know what you think about our stories. Call our Feedback Friday hotline, 513-852-4998, or visit WCPO.com/feedbackfriday, where you can submit a feedback video. My co-anchor Craig McGee shares your thoughts every Friday night at 6. That is This Week in Cincinnati for the Sunday. Join us for breaking news, weather, and sports at 6 and 11 tonight on WCPO 9 News. And we're always updating your headlines on WCPO.com.